Welcome to the Living Out podcast, helping people, churches and society talk about faith and sexuality. Hello and welcome to the show and our last episode of 2022. It's great to have you with us. My name's Anne Witten and alongside me is the lovely Andrew Bunt. It's 3 days until Christmas and Andrew, we all know that you love musicals. So I wanted to pose a music related question to kick off. What is your favourite carol?
Such a good question. I do love carols because I love good music and I love good theology. I love good theology too. So put the two together and you've got something special. Too many to choose from, really, aren't there? I mean, of the well-known classics, Hark the Herald is the best combination of a banging tune from Mendelssohn and some fantastic theology from Wesley, I think, isn't it? Charles Wesley. Amazing kind of doctrine of Christ in Hark the Herald Angels Sing. But then if we were going music only, something like Harold Dark's more modern setting of In the Bleak Midwinter is just beautiful. But my favourite recording of a carol, and obviously you've got to go and look this one up, favourite recording of a carol is a version of Joy to the World by the cast from Glee, the TV show. I would love to be part of a church that worships like the cast of Glee sing Joy to the World. Honestly, look it up. It's so good.
Oh my god! I might have known you'd have had different categories for favourite carol. You know? I mean, I was really. I don't even really like carols, so I was really struggling with this question.
What would you choose then?
Well, the problem with carols for me is because my vocal range is about 5 notes, and carols, tend to be quite sort of. About
Away in the Manger then probably is basically the limit for you. Yeah.
Well, to be honest, I would have actually chosen Hark the Herald for the reasons that you did. Great, it's basically the gospel, isn't it? Which is fabulous. And then as you said it, I thought, right, I need to pick a backup. In the Bleak Midwinter's my backup. So we're just two in sync, Andrew.
Indeed.
Anyway, let's introduce our guest. In this Meet the Authors series, we're interviewing people who've written pieces for the Living Out website, and it's so lovely to welcome Stuart Ferguson to the show. Hello, Stuart.
Hi, Anne, and hi, Andrew.
So, Stuart, I need to ask you, do you have a favourite carol?
So you don't like carols, but I'm not really great at celebrating Christmas, actually, or the Christian version of Christmas, at least.
Oh, no!
So don't get me wrong. Obviously, I love giving gifts and I love feasting with family, but Jesus asked us to remember his death and said nothing about celebrating his birth. Sorry, this is supposed to be a really light-hearted introductory question, isn't it? I've gone all heavy on you.
Stuart, this is the banter at the beginning. Keep it light.
And people will be listening to this 2 days before Christmas. They'll be preparing the turkey, wrapping the presents, filled of excitement.
Yeah. Anyway, I do love singing, though, and I particularly love carols. I really enjoy harmonising, and so carols are perfect for that. And so my favourite has got to be O Holy Night. It starts off quite low and then it rises up and then it goes all the way back down again. There's just some great melody in there and some of the words. I don't really like the first verse very much, but I love what you're saying, Andrew. Theology is important, but the third verse is great, actually. Truly he taught us to love one another. His law is love and his gospel is peace. Chains shall he break, for the slave is our brother. And in his name all oppression shall cease. And so it goes on. But yeah, there's lots of really great stuff in there.
Wow. I think I've only heard the first verse, so that's been an education. Fantastic. Thanks, Stuart.
Stuart, we'd love to get to know you a bit, hear a bit about your story, but first off, why not just tell us a bit about what you do when you're not on the Living Out podcast?
So I work for a small family-owned Christian building company in southeast London. I'm a site manager, so that means that I'm responsible for ensuring that the other workers know what they're doing on any given day and that they've got the tools and the materials they need, that the work is being done in the right order, and that the customer is happy. I do a little bit of lots of things, actually. So whether it's plumbing or carpentry, tiling, I do design work and drawings. I'm responsible for completing planning applications. and getting them sorted as well. I'm really excited about my job. So it's not just a company that's owned and run by Christians, but it's also run on Christian principles as well. So, for example, we take on apprentices who know that we're not just going to teach them a trade, but we're also going to disciple them as well. And so as a result, over the last 7 or 8 years, we've seen 4 folks become Christians, sort of directly through the company. And so, in a very unlikely way, my job sort of combines my 2 great passions, really, which is sort of design and fine handcraft skills with teaching people about why following Jesus is such a better life.
So good. It's such an amazing idea for a kind of business model and missional discipleship model. I love that. Really, really great. And so getting to know a bit more, Stuart, tell us a bit about your experience of same-sex attraction, when you first became aware of that, and kind of what that was like at that point, and how you began to process that.
Yeah, thank you. Where do I start? I come from a long line of Christians. I think all of my 8 great-grandparents were Christians, and in the Brethren movement. I was brought up in a tiny Brethren church, maybe only about 25 people at most. And so we knew each other really well. There was a real strong sense of extended family about it. We were in each other's homes often. And one thing I really value about being in that Christian family was that sense of being extended family together. Another thing that I really valued was the emphasis on Bible teaching, understanding the Word of God. So from early childhood, I don't know, before I could even understand what was being said, I was sitting through hour-long Bible studies every Sunday afternoon. There were others on Saturdays, sometimes, and then on Wednesday evenings as well. I think at one point I worked out I'd probably sat through over 1,000 hours of intense word-by-word, sort of verse-by-verse study of the Bible by the time I was about 22 when I finally left the Brethren. And so I'm forever grateful for that solid grounding in God's Word. However, I suppose by the time I hit puberty, I realised with a crushing blow, and it really was a significant, difficult moment, that I was clearly attracted to males and not females. I was devastated and disappointed. I was desperate. But I didn't feel comfortable sharing with any of my family or any of the folks in church. I didn't have anyone that I felt I could share the inner turmoil. And as a consequence, I went through my teens and into my 20s feeling desperately alone and abandoned. My thoughts actually grew darker. I hated various aspects of myself. And I even remember going through a phase of thinking all my problems would be solved if I could just be a girl. I've got, therefore, some very small inkling maybe of what some transgender folks might have gone through. I'm so glad I had no access to information about gender reassignment or anything like that. I know that would have potentially really been very difficult for me. About age 20, I went to college to study furniture design for 2 years. I began to hang out with some of the Christian students who weren't in my class, and it felt almost like for the first time I was properly choosing friends as opposed to having been put with people, or I was sharing a desk with them at school or whatever. And that allowed me to grow in confidence. They seemed to like me, and so that gave me permission to like myself, if you like. I then went on to join, skipping lots of bits, obviously. I went to join the second year of a degree course in North London, and it was a difficult first term because I'd left my friends behind, and I joined the second year, so all the first years had already bonded, and so I'm joining a group that's already bonded in the second year. I was living alone, and that brought back lots of the feelings and the sense of being alone and abandoned again. And so my thoughts began to grow darker again, and I decided I needed to see a counsellor or get some help. Otherwise, I was in danger of doing myself some harm. I'd kept my sexual orientation to myself for about 10 years, I think, about that point. And it just wasn't going to work anymore, sort of trying to hold that secret in. The isolation, the loneliness that came from that was just beginning to become too much. I cried out to God, and when I was at one of the early Christian Union meetings at university, they had a lady from a local church who came, and she talked a bit about prayer ministry for anyone that was needing help. I was looking for a church, and so I joined her church, and then I made good use of their prayer ministry services. And I feel like I've been on the road to sort of greater authenticity ever since. I've been on all sorts of courses, read all sorts of books. I've grown in my friendships so that I can. I've got folks that are well aware of my story, that's kind of. I feel like that's what's brought me to roughly to where I am now. I had to do quite a bit of work, I think, on what it meant to be a man, what sort of man I wanted to be. Ironically, I now find myself in the place of God asking me to teach straight guys how to be better men of God. The irony is not lost on me at all.
So good. Thank you so much for your honesty, Stuart. It's so encouraging to hear what God's done in your life. You mentioned there that you have come to a place now being kind of more open about your sexuality and sharing with various people. What was it like when you first began to do that? And particularly with some of the battles you've been through, what helped you to begin to share about your experience with friends or family or whoever it was you shared with first?
I suppose my biggest battle was not actually same-sex attraction. My biggest battle, I think, was my low self-esteem and lack of self-confidence, lack of ability to feel that I could be loved, that other people wanted. I'd rejected myself to such a deep degree that it meant that I found it hard to feel accepted by others. And so for me, it was a really simple, basic process of growing friendships, forming friendships and growing them to be authentic and at a depth that then allowed for sharing deeply, sharing difficult stuff, sharing the pain, not just the superficiality of what the weather's like or or what you're doing this week, or the typical kind of it's about being able to go deep in friendship and really allow myself to be cared for and actually care for other people myself.
Excellent. Investing in friendship is so important, isn't it? Actually, it's as we are building and investing into those, we get into sort of relationships where we can be honest about these kind of things. And actually, it does take effort and time, and it's a deliberate thing, I think, to do that. And I also like what you were saying. I think I would resonate with the experience of so many of the things in life I've had to work through, not actually being directly related to my sexuality. And I think when we do are same-sex attracted, say, or have questions around our sexuality, that can become a bit all-consuming. And either everything can be read in light of that, or we can overlook other things actually God wants to do in us to help us to grow or find healing from different things that happened or whatever. And it's so a healthy thing, what you're saying, to recognise that there's more to us than our sexualities. Sometimes there's some big stuff where God wants to do and to help us in. And what about having me open in church context with Christians and stuff? What kind of support have you found most helpful from the Christians in your life?
I am open at church, and I would really recommend that to anyone and everyone as well. Be authentic as possible. Obviously, where it and when it feels safe to do so. I've been open and safe with trusted friends at church over several years. I've been at my church for 25 years, so I have a long history there. But I think about 5 or 6 years ago, I had the opportunity to share my story much more deeply in a very open setting, a meeting for the whole of the church, as it were, and bring some teaching about homosexuality. I I'd been feeling for a while I wanted to do that, because I felt that there were aspects of my story that do honour God. His goodness, his goodness to us despite our brokenness, and how we might feel utterly useless or worthless, but actually God places great worth and value on us. And I knew that there were aspects of that part of my story that were useful, helpful to everybody, not just other strugglers with same-sex attraction or any other sexual difficulties, as it were. So the church has been very supportive. I feel very at home there. I feel very comfortable. I mean, I don't think I would have been able to share my story if I didn't.
It's so good to hear. Yeah, it's so important for us to hear these stories, actually, and a reminder to people of actually so often our experiences of sharing with churches are good, actually, and it's a safe place, an important thing for us to do that. And maybe that links to a final question I'll ask you. What advice would you give to a young same-sex attracted Christian who really wants to follow Jesus but is finding it tough? What would you say, looking back on a few years of your life, it's a lesson or some key wisdom you've learned to share with them?
I mean, I guess it does depend to some degree on what they're finding tough. I feel like emotionally our basic need is to feel accepted. And I feel like we get acceptance through what I sort of think of as the 3 A's: attention, affection, and affirmation. So I feel like we need to spend time with people who will give us their attention, who we can talk to. We do feel acceptance when we're listened to. We also feel accepted when people come close to us, either physically or emotionally. We need people who can hug us well, who will love us well, who will be appropriately affectionate with us. And then, so finally, I suppose, we need people who know what our struggles are, what we're battling with, who know when we've done well, even if it feels like a failure to us, who can encourage us and speak our worth back to us, because we feel accepted when we're affirmed. And of course, all of that is only going to happen within appropriate relationships. So the key is building strong, deep friendships where we can be authentic and vulnerable.
Yeah, so good, so helpful. Thank you.
I just wanted to do a plug for a fantastic new book by our very own Andrew Bunt. It's called Finding Your Best Identity, and it's a short Christian introduction to identity, sexuality and gender, which helps readers wrestle with the question, how do I find who I am? It's an excellent read, and if you've got Amazon Prime, you can get it in time for Christmas. So Stuart, you've written a couple of book reviews for the Living Out website. You reviewed True Friendship by Vaughan Roberts, and you've also reviewed A War of Loves by David Bennett, which is his account of how God took him from being a gay activist to a celibate disciple of Christ. And it's that book I particularly wanted to focus on. I've read that as well, and I found it really enlightening and encouraging. I wondered which bits of the book particularly resonated with your own story.
I want to say none of it. But that's partly why I think I enjoyed it. It was entirely different experience from my own and opened my eyes to other worlds. I mean, actually, his accounts of the pain of wrestling with unhealthy desires, wanting Jesus, but wanting a boyfriend as well, some of those things, resonated. And I think it was, it's always more powerful when there's an emotional kind of connection, as it were. So some of that.
Yeah, I guess he's got quite a different background from your own. I'm sure he hadn't listened to 1,000 hours of Brethren teaching by the time he was 20.
Indeed.
One of the things I liked about the book is that David talks about the need to stop idolising marriage and to value singleness and to create a culture, a church culture that's truly family, so that people like us can thrive.
Yeah.
How do you think we can do that? And is this something your church is good at? You mentioned that you've been in your church for 25 years, so there must be something that's kind of keeping you there. Is it good at doing church family?
Actually, I know that you, Andrew, and Ed and others have been preaching and teaching on this for years about idolatry of marriage, particularly in the church. We need to encourage families to be open and inclusive. Who else could be joining in your Christmas dinner this year? An old lady who lives on her own, an international student away from his family, a single mum and her child. My parents are great at this. I haven't given them grandchildren, so we fill the table up at Christmas with single friends instead. How do we stop idolising marriage? I guess by teaching that marriage isn't enough, that we all need intimacy in many relationships and not just one. We can make a start on intimacy now as well. Start having many appropriately intimate relationships. Jesus said there will be no marriage in heaven. I assume that means there'll be no sex either, but heaven will be better and brighter, fuller and be a greater expression of real life. I believe that we will all know each other intimately on an entirely different level than maybe any sexual relationship now could allow for. We will have no shame to keep us hiding from each other, no fear of being exposed. We won't have any insecurities to cripple us. There won't be anything to be ashamed of. We won't need to be in denial or feel guilty. We're not going to be guilty anymore. And so that will mean that we can fully know each other and be fully known. And so I feel like we need that teaching. So let's start now. Those intimate relationships that are going to go on into a much greater depth in heaven. I'm really glad that the church is championing marriage. I mean, especially in our culture, which has seen a gradual sort of devaluing and decline of it. I think that it's great that there's a successful marriage course. But I want to see a singles course, a course about how to have strong, stable, deep and healthy relationships, how to find your place in community, how to serve others and how to value yourself well. And those are things that apply to everybody, married or single. But I sort of feel like I could do with going on a course and learning some of this stuff. Actually, Vaughan's book was really helpful in that, and in building, deeper friendships. In terms of my church particularly, I think single people have been honoured and really valued well in my church. I don't feel sidelined or left out or forgotten because of being single. Rather, I think folks have made significant efforts to include me and involve me in their family lives. Whether that's going on holiday or it's not just for Sunday lunch. I've been thoroughly included. So, yeah.
That's amazing. It's great to hear that you've had positive experience of church as family rather than just somewhere that you turn up and have a meeting and then go home. It is much more than that, isn't it? It's about sort of sharing life together.
Yeah. I realise that's not everybody's experience either. I realise that, there are some horrific stories out there of people feeling, exposed and sidelined and, left out. So I realise I've had a good experience.
And I like that you are taking the initiative to do things as well, like we were saying about inviting people around for meals and that kind of thing, creating community, because I think sometimes, and I've been guilty of this, especially when I was kind of in my 20s and 30s, I think sometimes as singles we expect other people to take the initiative in including us and building community and everything, but actually we are the church too.
Exactly.
We can take those first steps towards other people. We can spot who's marginalised or on the fringes and include them and kind of model how it's done, really. So
yes, yeah, I think hospitality is a sort of an underrated form of spiritual warfare. You break people's sense of loneliness and isolation when you invite them round and share a meal and share your home. I think that's. I think we don't often think that way, but that's been my experience actually when I've been feeling slightly lonely or left out or or not feeling like somehow the married couple or the family have got it better, and then being included in that, it just breaks through some of the way that the enemy would love to isolate us and single us off.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, you're right. I liked what you mentioned as well about the need to sort of have a singleness course and think about the skills that we need and the kind of biblical principles that we need to hold on to do singleness well, to do intimacy well. I think that there is actually a course called Securely Single, which I'm kind of exploring at the moment. So it's good that things are out there, and this is, you know, a need that's starting to be met. So
I've not heard of that. Thank you.
yeah, I'll pop a link in the show notes. I loved what you wrote in your review of David's book, that it concludes with a discourse elevating celibacy as not just adequate, but a way to live that has the potential to honour God, to be spiritually fruitful, and to provide for our physical needs and be emotionally satisfying. That sounds like a fantastic advert for celibacy. How have you found that to be true in your own life?
Oh, wow. I really wrestle with some aspects of celibacy. I'm sort of relatively content with the idea that I might not ever marry. And I'm becoming easier with the thought that I might never father biological children. But my love language is touch, and I live alone as a single Christian Englishman in London, and I feel that there aren't many other sort of scenarios where I might get less touch. Our culture isn't good at touch between adults who aren't in a romantic relationship, and especially men. I know that touch and sex are very different, but I think that our culture, and particularly our Western church culture, isn't very good at differentiating much between them. And I think a serious lack of culturally appropriate ways of sort of being affectionate is the consequence of that. If the only touch which is to be reserved for marriage is that of a sexual nature, then it should be possible for me to have a good long cuddle with someone, shouldn't it? Walking down the road holding hands should be fine. But they're just not appropriate for our culture. So I have needs for physical affection which don't seem to have any appropriate context in which to be met. And so that is an ongoing struggle. But having said that, yes, I've had young people at church say that they find my celibacy God-honouring, and actually I have many spiritual children, and other spiritual fruitfulness too. I'm convinced that even in celibacy, most of my physical and all of my emotional needs could be satisfied within Christian community, in the body of Christ, the church. So I believe the potential is there. As always, some change is necessary, change in attitudes and breaking of some unhealthy cultural taboos, perhaps. But I am convinced that, as I said, you know, the quote that you gave of mine from the book review, I am convinced that it is possible, even though our culture doesn't make it easy.
Yeah, it's interesting that there are some cultures that are much better at non-sexual physical affection. I mean, in some countries it is fine for two men to walk down the road holding hands. That is completely culturally acceptable. And I guess here, I think it is probably harder for guys. I think women find it easier to be more tactile without it being a sexual thing. But yeah, I just I like the fact that as a church we can be countercultural and kind of push back against that, you know, romantic relationship where you can do everything physically on one hand, or singleness and isolation and not really touching anybody in any way on the other hand. You know, I think going back to some of the stuff that you talked about, real good godly intimate friendship, I think, you know, we can be at the vanguard of modelling what that looks like.
Yeah, and I feel like for myself, my touch needs are being met as I'm vulnerable in my deeper friendships. So a number of folks at church who I've shared, look, touch is my love language. I feel loved, you know, when I'm close to people, when I'm in physical contact with them. And so they make a specific point of hugging me.
That's amazing.
And that's the way that it gets worked out. And, you know, the more that friends trust me and I can trust them, the more they feel they don't really care what other people think when they see us being affectionate. And that's when the cultural taboos are broken through, is when somebody realises the value and in spite of what others might think, is still willing to kind of go there.
That's brilliant. And I love that you're actually kind of saying to people, these are my need, this is what I need, you know, because I think sometimes we expect people to sort of guess, to pick up on, you know, how we're feeling or what we're missing out on. But it is important for us to say, you know, this is how God's made me, this is what I need, this is how I experience intimacy, and to ask those questions about other people as well. How can I be a good friend to you? How can I show you the love of God through the way that I relate with you?
Yeah,
that's brilliant. I feel like I've learned loads about friendship from you, Stuart. I wish you lived a bit nearer, because I would give you a massive hug right now. My love language is also physical touch, so yeah, I just go around hugging everyone whether they like it or not.
Fair enough.
That's all we've got time for today, sadly. But thank you so much, Stuart, for joining us. It's been brilliant to hear more of your story and to bask in your wisdom.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. We'll have you back. Thank you to all our listeners, and don't forget to rate us and share us with your friends and church leaders. We'll be back in the new year with another of our fantastic authors. But in the meantime, why not have an explore of our website at livingout.org, and have a wonderful Christmas. Bye for now.